All right, saddle up laptop lovers, and especially you penny pinchers, because I've got a special one for you today, all right? This is the Omen Max 16 from HP, and it's honestly one of the laptops I was most excited to try out in 2025. The HP Omen series, it's kind of had a special place in my heart. I mean, really, it's like a little childhood friend, right? The Omen laptops have had their ups and downs throughout the years, but it was my first gaming laptop. I loved, the HP Omen 15 that I had. And while, of course, they were never the best laptops at anything, they always provided really good value for the money. And I'm extremely stoked because now HP has leveled up their game. Like, all of a sudden, HP was like, look, this year we're going hard. We don't care. They went to Vegas and they put it all on red. And they said, here it is. So I'm stoked on this thing because really it's unlike anything we've seen before from HP. Like, this is an extremely sturdy, mostly metal body, super sleek design, right? And the power and cooling solution, like, this actually puts it at one of the top spots in performance in 2025 too. So yeah, this is nothing like what we used to see from HP Omen on the 16-inch side in the past. So yeah, this guy is a beast. And for all you, thrift store, Facebook marketplace shoppers out there, you're going to love it too because the prices are insanely low compared to the competition. So let's talk about it. So here I have the RTX 5090 model, but like usual, I'm going to try and give you an idea of how all the configurations will perform. So you'll be pretty well informed no matter which one you get. This one right here has the new Intel Core Ultra 275HX CPU. And keep in mind, this is not an efficient CPU like the 285H. And yes, I know Intel's confusing everyone calling these Core Ultra now when, last year the Core Ultra meant it was an efficient chip. These are not efficient, right? This is not like the Core Ultra 285H or 185H from last year. This is more like your 14900HX, 13900HX. They're very powerful. They have really high peak performance, but they're not going to grant you like insane battery life or anything like that. So just keep that in mind. The HX moniker is what means, less battery life, less efficiency. Opposite of the H moniker for Intel, which is efficiency and battery life above all else. But this laptop actually surprisingly comes with an AMD HX 300 line of CPUs as well. So you can spec it up with like the HX 375, and that's the opposite. AMD kind of screwed everything up, to be honest, and now they have an HX CPU that is efficient. So yeah, they really threw everyone off there. But the HX 375, HX 370, those are efficient CPUs, great for battery life. And this is one of the few laptops that actually has those paired with a full wattage GPU this year. This might be the only laptop actually that has that combination. So you can actually get good battery life and top tier performance out of one device. Like, that's crazy. Every other like thicker laptop like this is coming with, just the Intel 275HX or the battery hungry AMD 9955HX. So yeah, really your only major sacrifice here is the weight. She's heavy, right? It was a bit of a surprise to me how much heavier and thicker it is than how I thought it looked at CES. Like, it's kind of a monster, right? Now, compared to the Legion Pro 7i from Lenovo, like, yeah, it is a little bit sleeker, a little bit thinner than that one, although they are about the same weight. So unfortunately, that was kind of a hard pill to swallow for me as someone who values portability. Like, this is a really heavy laptop coming in at about 6 pounds. That is 40% heavier than the most portable gaming laptop, which is the Zephyrus G16 from Asus. Like, this feels like nothing in one hand, while this feels like, you're actually lifting something at the gym. Not to mention, there's a huge 380 watt charger that comes with the 5080 and 5090 model of this laptop, which adds over 2 more pounds to the total weight. So yeah, this is not even close to the same weight class as like a Razer Blade 16 or the Zephyrus G16 here. It's definitely more in line with your Legion Pro 7i. You will feel a massive difference, especially if you're trying to carry this with one arm or in your backpack. But I think the heaviest overall in the 16-inch laptop class is actually Alienware Area 51, coming in at 7.25 pounds. So it could be worse, I guess. Now, the black color is pretty sleek looking, right? It borrows a lot of its design elements from the HP Omen Transcend 14 that we saw released last year, and I love that laptop. Like, this is definitely my favorite HP design I've ever seen on a laptop. It can attract some fingerprints, but it's not nearly as bad as the Razer Blade 16. And you actually can get this in white as well, although I haven't seen that one in person. And of course, you have your light bar on the front, which looks amazing. Come on. Now, the typing experience, It's awesome. It borrows the same pudding cap design that we saw on the Omen 14, and a lot of people love it. And a lot of people hate it. It's just one of those things, it's going to be pretty divisive in the way this looks. Personally, I think it kind of looks like one of those like early 2000s gaming keyboards, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, I guess. Now, the trackpad is unfortunately not glass. I mean, it's a pretty decent size. I just wish it was glass. Although I must admit, it almost had me fooled. This is probably the best plastic trackpad I've ever felt. It took me a little bit to even realize it wasn't glass. So yeah, good job HP, but also, come on, like it's 2020. We should not have plastic trackpads in laptops that cost thousands of dollars. And I'm looking at you too, Lenovo. I'm coming for you. You're not innocent in this. Anyways. Now, the display is the same 16-inch OLED display that you're going to see on pretty much every other 16-inch laptop on the market. They all use the same exact panel from Samsung, the only difference being the anti-reflective coating that these have, and then the Legion Pro 7i for 2025 actually has the same panel but a year newer, so it actually hits slightly higher peak brightness in HDR and slightly higher full panel brightness. But yeah, other than that, if you see OLED on a 16-inch gaming laptop, they're all the same, right? It's 1600p, 16 by 10 aspect ratio, 240 hertz. Pretty much all of them can hit about 700 nits in like a smaller window. And then this one hits almost 600 nits on a full blank white screen, which is really good for an OLED panel. Like thinking about like monitors, there's a lot of OLED gaming monitors that only hit like 250 nits or something when they're full screen white. So for this to hit nearly 600 nits there is really good. It's pretty much the same as like the G16 and all those too. They all use an S-stripe subpixel layout, which is the best for burn-in prevention, and it's good for text clarity as well. I didn't notice any problems reading text, and you almost have to be like trying to burn these in nowadays. With the modern technology that OLED panels have, I'm not worried about it. One major difference though is the anti-reflective coating is nowhere near that of like the Zephyrus G16. This is almost a mirror. You're gonna see reflections pretty bad, although not as bad as the Legion Pro 7i. That one is a straight up mirror. As much as I love glossy displays, I just really appreciate the anti-reflective coating that the G16 has, and I'm happy that the Omen at least has something there. It's not much, but there's at least something. Another thing I noticed is that the Omen Max 16 does not have a built-in color profile, which I thought was really weird. So right out of the box, the colors are like more vivid than other laptops. Like if I put this next to the G16, for example, or the Legion Pro 7i, like the yellow on the Cyberpunk, for example, is more vibrant. Like colors like red, yellow, green, they really stick out on this panel, which looks really good, but I know it's not accurate. Something is happening that is really overinflating the saturation on this panel, and there's no color profiles that are built in to fix that. Like the Legion Pro 7i, the G16, you can change profiles from sRGB, DCI-P3. You can't do that on the Omen. It's just stuck with what it has. So you have to pretty much make a custom color profile or go into like NVIDIA Control Panel or Intel Graphics Command Center to fix this saturation, because while it looks great, it's simply oversaturated. Like I could do the same thing on these other panels by just boosting the saturation even more. So yeah, I don't know if they were like just trying to be sneaky and make it look really good, but creators are going to have to really look out here and make sure that you calibrate this thing as needed. And when I had first recorded this, there actually was no 60 hertz available when you were in Optimus mode. You were just kind of stuck with 240 hertz, which was pretty not good for battery, right? However, I did have a BIOS update and that seems to be fixed. So now when you switch to eco mode, you now get 60 hertz as it should be. So props to HP for finding that and fixing it so quick. All right, Omen Max 16 webcam test. Gets kind of dark when there's a light in the background, but other than that, not too bad. So for ports, we've got two USB-C Thunderbolt 4 ports on the left. These have DisplayPort out and they run through Optimus, unfortunately. So they hit the integrated graphics first before they hit the GPU, which means no G-Sync. But if you're editing video on a monitor, this actually is helpful for keeping Intel QuickSync active. So video editors, you'll know what I'm talking about. And of course, if you're on battery, connecting a monitor to one of these will keep it from draining as fast. Plus, you still get Intel's variable refresh rate, their version of that out of this. So, it may not be a huge deal breaker, but it also might be for people that don't use HDMI. Then the last port right here is the audio combo jack. And then on this side, we just have a USB-A 3.2 port, so super simple. But here's where things get interesting, and this is going to make Lenovo fans pretty happy since Lenovo completely abandoned that on this year's Legion. But yes, most of the ports are on the back of the laptop, so you can get a very neat look on a desk. You've got the power jack, you've got 2.5 gigabit Ethernet out, you've got HDMI 2.1, so 4K 120 hertz output directly from the GPU, so you get G-Sync to your monitor. And then lastly, you've got another USB-A 3.2 port. The only thing I wish it had here was a SD card slot, but at least you get an Ethernet port, which is becoming more and more rare nowadays. Now, the insides look beautiful here. Like, you have a nice big vapor chamber, and I just love the way this is laid out. Like, it looks so clean. It has HP's new proprietary liquid metal compound on the CPU and GPU. So this is what they're claiming is going to be better than your typical liquid metal because it doesn't leak out, which can happen on some regular liquid metal laptops, especially when it isn't applied well enough at the factory. So yeah, this is a benefit, but I will say though, there is a bit of a downside because it doesn't actually give you quite the same level of temperatures as pure liquid metal does. And I found that out thanks to my good friend Braxton here. Other than that, you've got two swappable RAM slots, DDR5 RAM, but one of the major cons here is actually with the SSD slots. So the stock SSD is located underneath a heat pipe, which you'd have to lift the entire cooler up to replace. Luckily, it's a really good drive from the factory, so you probably wouldn't actually have to ever do that since you can add in your own drive to the second slot that's open right here. But still, this was a pretty odd choice by HP. And by the way, the 5070 model and below, you can apparently remove that SSD with tweezers and you don't have to do all the cooler and all that stuff, but still, it's just strange. Now, as far as the speakers go, it's nothing to write home about. I mean, you know, it's not super impressive. They're okay. It's just, I'm so used to the Zephyrus laptops now, which have like the best Windows laptop speakers I've ever heard. But here's the sound sample just so you can see how it compares.
Laptop speaker test. Laptop speakers can get around the air. These laptop speakers sound so loud and clear. Can you hear the noise? Did your eardrums get destroyed by these laptop speakers? Yeah, they're playing for you.
So battery life, you know, the 275HX promised more efficiency, and it did, you know, at like that 10 watt to like 50 watt range. But battery life really depends a lot on what can the CPU do below 10 watts. And that's where it's still not really catching up with other CPUs out there like the Intel 285H or the 185H or the Ryzen HX 370. You know, all those other CPUs, they still far surpass this one in battery life. So yeah, unfortunately, we're only going to hit like 6 hours on this guy. You know, that's with YouTube playback, about 30% brightness, silent mode, eco mode. So you can expect even less if you're doing, you know, a bunch of tasks, like a bunch of documents open and a bunch of tabs open. I was trying this out with some basic tasks. I was able to get it to around 14 watts of discharge at the lowest, which would be about 7 hours. But again, your mileage may vary, but really do not expect more than like 6 or 7 hours at the very most on this guy. These Intel HX chips just have a long ways to go to be more competitive in the battery field. All right, so fan noise on the Omen Max 16. So this laptop can run its fans very quiet and also very loud. And that's where I think it's really important to understand power profiles because you see complaints, you know, from people like, hey, this laptop is too loud, you know, then other people are like, wait, no, I think it's fine. That's usually because of power profiles. So that's why I tackle this in a really different way to other reviewers, and you'll see that in a second. But first off, I just want to say, when you're just doing light tasks and you're in the stock, you know, eco mode, or even the stock balance mode, just browsing in internet, stuff like that, it's pretty much dead silent. Like, you might hear the fans going, and I think they do maintain a really low RPM, but it's so quiet that you really can't even hear it. And even in the BIOS, there's actually a way to disable the fans from being on all the time if you want. Either way though, I mean, like I said, it's running at such a low RPM when you're just browsing and stuff like that. Like, you probably won't even notice, especially if you have the speakers going. So I think they did great there. When you're gaming, it's a completely different story because it just really depends on the power profile that you're running at. And there's a lot that that you can do to tune this. So if you stick around for like the thermals and wattage section and my recommended settings, you'll see that you can actually get a lot of performance for very little fan noise out of this machine, like some of the best out there as far as performance per decibel, which leads me to performance per decibel. So I've created a graph here. This is kind of like my Frankenstein, right? This is like something I built from the ground up to sort of demonstrate how much performance that you get for every decibel of fan noise. Because, you know, there's some laptops out there that get great performance, but they're running their fans super loud. You know, so a lot of them might only be achieving that level of performance because of the loud fans. So it helps to sort of illustrate that fan noise bias. And of course, there's still going to be a GPU bias. You know, higher tier GPUs are of course going to be a little bit higher on this chart. But basically the way to look at it is the yellow bars here are your fan noise in decibels. And remember, the way decibels scale, every single decibel is like a 10% increase in volume. It is a very significant change and noticeable for every 1 decibel increase. For every 10 decibels, you know, that's a 2 times increase in volume or a 10 times increase in sound intensity. Like for example here, anything over like 50 decibels, you can hear from outside of the room easily. Whereas like 35 decibels is like a whisper, a quiet whisper. And then the blue bars here are how many points you get in the TimeSpy graphics score for each decibel of fan noise. So think of it sort of like, you know, the higher the number here, the more FPS that you get for every single decibel of fan noise. So you can see the Omen Max 16 here, it leads the pack by a pretty big margin. And that's partially due to just the sheer performance that you get out of the 5090 in this thing. Like it's running its 5090 at the full 175 watts, max performance. It's surpassing any other laptop I've recorded. And yeah, the fans are loud. This is its performance / turbo mode. I call it turbo mode, but they call it performance in the Omen Gaming Hub. Either way though, 52 decibels is very loud. This is at head level. So yeah, you're going to hear that from the room over, down the hall. Like you're getting insane performance, but you know, it's loud. It's still looking better though than like the Blade 16 5090, which is running at 54 decibels. Again, that's like a 20% increase in volume. That is loud. You're going to hear that from the room over, even with the door shut. So yeah, in turbo mode, you're going to want headphones on. And just to see what would happen, I went ahead and adjusted the unleashed mode, which I'll show you in my recommended settings. I just set the fan's RPM to 3800, which is about 47 decibels. And that just unleashed as far as fan noise per decibel, 47 decibels, 537 points per decibel. Like now nothing even comes close. So you can easily achieve insane performance with much less noise on this guy. However, the story changes completely in balance mode, like completely. We are now getting 43 decibels. That is almost cutting the fan noise in half. They honestly didn't even need to make turbo mode that loud. Like look at this. You're getting still 454 points per decibel in TimeSpy, still top of the chart. The only thing up there with it was like the Blade 16 from 2 years ago, which had really great fan tuning as well. But yeah, 43 decibels is pretty quiet. Like I'm actually really happy with that result. You can comfortably game in balance mode, like around people without them being like, bro, your laptop is about to take off, right? 43 decibels is very passable for like not being a jet engine. So this is just an insanely good result. Like look at the Blade 16 in comparison, 50 decibels in its balance mode. That's more than a lot of laptops in their turbo modes. So that is crazy. Even the new Zephyrus G16, like I really hope they patch that thing because 50.5 decibels in balance mode, unacceptable. It's crazy. Way too loud. That's what, like 70% louder? Nah. And then again, in balance mode, I went into Unleashed, set it at the minimum RPM, set the GPU wattage to the minimum it would go. Temps were fine. You'll see this in my recommended settings, but look at that. Leading the pack by an enormous amount, 44 decibels. Yeah, you only gain 1 decibel, but you gain a ton of performance. So I'm going to go ahead and call it. The Max 16 is the fan noise to performance king out of everything I've tested so far. And then we get into silent mode. And I actually have this split up into 2 different results because there is a 60 FPS cap by default in silent mode that you can disable, which will increase the fan noise, but it also increases performance. So if you have the default 60 FPS cap, it runs at a super quiet 36 decibels of fan noise. And yeah, I mean, you're limited to 60 FPS, but you know, in some games that's not too bad. In other games that you might have had like 150 FPS otherwise, yeah, not as great. But still, 36 decibels is very respectable. That's really ideally how we want to see balance modes. I hate seeing silent mode over 40 decibels like you do on the new G16 when you're gaming, or the new G14 when you're gaming, or the Blade 16. Like to me, that's not even silent mode. Now remember, this is gaming. This is not like when you're just doing Excel and stuff like that. They're all quieter than this when you're doing that. This is when you're gaming in silent mode. So yeah, 36 decibels, that's basically whisper quiet. You could easily bring this out in front of people and be gaming very comfortably without them even noticing. Like the speakers, even at like 30% volume, will be louder than the fans. Whereas if you remove the FPS FPS cap, you hit about just like 1 decibel less than the regular balance mode. So at 42 decibels, it's, you know, that's not really much of a silent mode anymore. You might as well just be in balance mode at that point, but it actually does go a little bit under that as long as your temps don't get too high. So if you're not playing anything too demanding, it can actually stay a little bit under 42 decibels. Like you might see it hovering around 39 or 40 decibels instead. So there's a little bit of compromise, a little bit of variability depending on what you're playing. I was just kind of maxing it out, seeing what it could do the most, which I mean, it's still a great result, 443 points per decibel. The only thing beating that was like the G14 4090, which was just god tier how low you could get the fan noise on that thing. So now in silent mode, Unleashed can only get so low. And technically I could put that balance mode result here since it was like 44 decibels, but that would be like a really loud silent mode. So I wouldn't actually do that. Unfortunately, that was like the minimum RPM that you could put the fans at. So, you know, if you're trying to game at less than 40 decibels on this thing, it's best to keep that FPS cap in place. And here's sound samples of how the fans sound in comparison to other laptops. All right, so the Omen Gaming Hub software is pretty intuitive. It has a few really cool features and a few key features that I feel like are missing. So I'm gonna talk about it real quick. First of all, there's a ton of stuff when you open this. There's like ads, there's like games, AI, freaking whatever. And I'm gonna be honest with you, you can pretty much ignore all of this except for your device, which is your Omen Max. You can hit it from the sidebar or just click it right here. And at first it just shows you like vitals. So it's gonna show you, you know, temps, stuff like that. But the bulk of everything is gonna be right here on the performance control tab. So starting with eco mode, first of all, I recommend checking the box so that it auto applies eco mode as soon as you unplug. But yeah, eco mode is just very basic, right? You have no control really over anything. It just tries to make it as quiet as possible and temps are as low as possible. By default, this has a 60 FPS cap, but you can bypass that using NVIDIA control panel, which turns this eco mode into like a god tier silent mode. But more on that later. And by the way, the hotkey for switching between these power modes is function P. Next up is balance mode, which gives you two controls. You can do auto fans or max fans. For some reason, they thought that made sense. So yeah, most of the time, if you're in balance mode, you're just going to want auto fans. I don't even know why max is an option here when this is a lower power level setting. They could have at least had a fan curve on the balance mode. I don't really get what this was about. But basically, this setting runs at a decently low RPM on fans. Actually, I really prefer this mode. Then there's performance mode. And now this one has even more settings. We have a power settings tab now. Again, the fan speed for some reason is still locked to either auto or max. Auto is pretty loud here, but max is extremely loud. So I really just wish they would have had a fan curve. There's only one power profile that has a fan curve, which is Unleashed, but we'll get to that. So the power settings tab is really crucial because by default, this is turned off. And that's basically your dynamic boost. Like your GPU wattage will be significantly lower if this is not enabled. The fact that it's not enabled by default is actually crazy on HP's part. And I think you're going to see a lot of mixed numbers on reviews for Omen Max 16 units because of this right here. I think a lot of reviewers who don't really pay attention are going to just be like, well, performance mode means, you know, I'm going to get the most power, right? Just throw it in performance mode and run all my benchmarks. Well, that would suck if they did because they're going to be losing out on a lot of FPS. So please, for the love of God, when you get this laptop, turn this on. There is no downside to this. It's just free performance. This is literally what lets the laptop run at the wattage that it's rated for. You do not want to be missing out on like 25 to 50 watts of power on your GPU. Trust me. And it has this maximum battery drain slider. Like your battery is not going to drain. Okay. This thing comes with a freaking like 380 watt power adapter. You're fine. Honestly, I think HP really dropped the ball here with this performance mode, this turbo mode. Like hopefully they're paying attention and they fix this ASAP. This should always be by default applied and, you know, give people the option. Sure. If they want to lower their GPU wattage, get a little bit cooler temps or something, you know, whatever. But no, if I'm in turbo mode, I want at least like close to the max wattage that I can get, you know? So yeah, very crucial setting. Next one one is Unleashed. Okay, so this is actually a crazy performance mode. You're going to hear the fans over my mic, but this mode actually gives you the most control over your fans, which means you can run them actually even quieter, as low as, you know, right here, 3600 RPM, which is like a little over 44, 45 decibels. And then you can run it as high as, you know, the max fan speed. And I really don't know what HP was thinking. This should have been on every single power profile, not just Unleashed, because technically you can make Unleashed quieter than balanced mode. Like, that makes no sense, while giving it more power than balanced mode. Or you can just make this, you know, your highest fan speeds, highest power, whatever you want. There's also a dynamic fan curve, so you can actually adjust what the fan speed will be at every level of temperature. Of course, to a certain degree. They only let you go as low as like 30% up until like 75 degrees. But yeah, they give you responsive fan curves in accordance with the GPU, the CPU, and the chassis of the laptop. So that's pretty cool. And there is like a split second of like a little lag / hang up every time you change one of these, which is kind of annoying, but yeah, it's something that happens. Now, power settings for Unleashed is where things get pretty crazy. These are settings that you would normally find in like the BIOS of a laptop, but here they are just right here. So I mean, now PL1 and PL2 are pretty standard. This is your long-term power limit and then your short-term power limit. So you can make Unleashed be a little quiet with like 35 watts, or you can run it full bore at like, you know, 160 watts on the CPU. This is a great way of controlling your CPU temps, which I'll show later on in the video. And then PL4 is like your instantaneous power limit. Like, it might spike to 200 watts on the CPU for just like a split second. That's what that one's for. I had to ask my buddy Braxton what these other ones meant, because I don't usually go this far into tweaking laptop CPU settings. So these aren't usually available on most laptops either. So ICC max is the maximum allotted amperage allowed to be delivered to the system's CPU VRMs. Yeah, that's a lot. I might be wrong here, but I think lower is better, but I leave this at default because when I tried messing with it, I just ran into a lot of errors and blue screens, stuff like that, things crashing, you know. Load line calibration, you know, the higher it is, the more performance you're going to get. This is kind of like curve optimizer for AMD, basically shifts up the entire voltage and frequency curve by certain amounts. So it's like almost sort of undervolting in a way, but yeah, I found anything other than the default value, which is 1, would cause things to crash and not work well. So I don't know if I just got a bad CPU bin, you know, maybe other people will have better luck with this, but yeah, it's nice to have some options though for tweaking your performance on this guy. And again, we have smart performance gain. I think by default it was set to 40 watts here for some reason. So if you want that max GPU wattage, again, move it to 50 watts. Same with battery drain, make sure it's on the max 40%, even though that will never actually happen. And then chassis temperature, you can set a limit for how hot you want the chassis to possibly get. So again, leave this at the highest for the most performance. I never really found the chassis to be too hot, but hey, you can always lower it if you do. Now, advanced performance tuning is where things get a little interesting. You can actually overclock your CPU here, and they have a little benchmark so you can test the stability, and you can also undervolt. So your ratio is how you overclock, and then your voltage offset is how you undervolt. You just want to test to make sure that things are stable, but yeah, otherwise this is, you know, pretty much free CPU performance. And then on the GPU tab, you have your overclocking, which goes up to 200 core and 400 memory. Honestly, the 5080 and 5090 and 5070 Ti can do a lot more than that, so you could easily run like 300 to 400 core using something like MSI Afterburner and still be very stable. But it's still nice that they have this feature here for those who want a little free extra performance, as long as things are stable. The lighting tab is basically where you go to change your lighting, with more advanced features in the Light Studio on the left side. Graphics switcher is where you can go to disable the DGPU. You can select integrated graphics only. This is, you know, if you're planning on being on battery for a long time, highly recommend doing this. This makes it to where the GPU is never called on, it's just gone, right? Sadly though, this does require a reboot. I don't know how Asus does it, but they're like the only ones that don't make you reboot for when you're running off just the iGPU. I guess Lenovo too, but it's kind of finicky on theirs. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The rest are just gimmicky settings. I just really wanted to go over the performance modes because those are pretty important and also very confusing. So I hope that cleared up some things for a lot of people who are considering this laptop, or even if you already own it. I'm also going to quickly go through the BIOS settings here just for you to look at. It's a pretty decent BIOS. There's a good amount of configuration, nothing too crazy. One thing that really stood out to me though was that you can actually turn the fans to always on to off. So this way, you know, if you're in silent mode and nothing's happening, the fans will actually turn completely off instead of running at a lower RPM, which I thought was pretty cool. Okay, the CPU on the Omen Max 16, Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX. This is an Arrow Lake chip from Intel, which is really weird that they even named it that because it's not even close, like in relationship to like a 285H that you see on like the Zephyrus G16. That's like a really efficient, battery-friendly Intel chip that's more similar to like the Meteor Lake chips, like 185H. The 275HX is a lot more like Raptor Lake. It's a lot more like the 13900HX, the 14900HX that we were seeing on last gen's laptop. laptops. It's very similar in performance to those, but with a bit more efficiency. So yeah, it's really confusing with Intel calling these Core Ultra, but just keep in mind for Intel, HX is like power hungry, not really battery friendly, and then H is like more battery friendly, you know, but still a decent bit of performance. But yeah, this chip has 24 cores, 8 performance cores, 16 efficient cores, and up to 5.4 gigahertz max frequency. From what I've seen out there, it's pretty comparable to the 9955HX from AMD. In fact, like you really can't go wrong either way you go, although it does seem like the 275HX has better battery life than that specific AMD CPU. Speaking of which, the HP Omen Max 16 comes with a variety of CPUs, so hopefully I can give at least some insight on some of these, but I was actually really surprised to see that it has a Ryzen 9 HX370, which is like AMD's more efficient, battery-friendly CPU, because we usually don't get that paired with a high-powered GPU like the 5090. That never actually happens. Actually, I think this is the only laptop to give us that. So yeah, let's look at how these CPUs perform. So right off the bat, I mean, it's pretty much the leader out there. Like AMD's AI Max 395 Plus does win in efficiency, which you'll see in a little bit, but we're getting 37K in Cinebench R23, which I prefer over R24, by the way, because it actually pushes the CPU, uses the raw power of the CPU, pushing it to its full extent, whereas 24 depends on a lot of other things like memory and some other system resources. So I've just always found it more reliable on how a CPU actually performs. So yeah, 34,000, like pretty good score. You know, it doesn't look much better than like the 13900HX from a couple of years ago, because again, it's very similar to that chip, but Intel just really focused on efficiency this time around, and you'll see that in the charts that are coming up. Like peak performance didn't change that much, but lower wattage performance changed a lot, and single core performance improved too. We're hitting like 2180. So balance mode, this is where you start to see things shift, right? Almost 27,000. That puts us quite a bit further than the 13900HX, 14900HX Raptor Lake CPUs. And then in silent mode, you know, the Omen Max 16 does run it at only 44 watts, so it actually is a little bit lower than Legion Pro 7i with the same CPU, but still 20K in silent mode is pretty crazy. And there's more to come on this, so stay tuned. And on battery, we actually stay around that 20,000 mark, running at about 45 watts or so. And same with USB-C, it's actually decently reliable here, almost 19,000 points, so not a bad laptop for, you know, handling CPU tasks on USB-C power delivery. Now I want to show you the most important graph for a laptop's CPU. This is our CPU power scaling graph. So this shows you how much performance you're getting out of your laptop at certain wattages. So naturally, as wattage goes up, your performance increases, right? Some CPUs will sort of plateau once they hit a certain wattage, but generally for laptops, we want to see a lot of performance at low wattage. We want to see those numbers higher at the beginning. We want to see 10 watts, 20 watts, 30 watts, you know, that range. The higher that is, the better things like battery life, lower fan noise, better temperatures. You don't need as much CPU wattage in games, so power doesn't have to run as high. That is our efficiency. This is where MacBooks excel, which I'll show you in a second. And then if you're a desktop user, you don't really care about any of this because you really just want your CPU, you know, it's going to hit like 100 watts, 150 watts. You don't really care. Laptop users, we want lower wattage. So this 20 to 50 to 60 watt range is critical for laptops because that's where you're going to see your CPU the most in games. And that is where the 275HX really excels. Yeah, I'm going to zoom in here. And of course, it still loses out to some laptop Ryzen CPUs. You know, the HX370 is super efficient all the way up until like 50 watts. The AI Max plus 395 is actually better across the board, but it's only in like one laptop. But the biggest comparison I want to highlight here is the 275HX in comparison to Raptor Lake. That's the 13900HX, the 14900HX. We are miles ahead of those, especially at, you know, 20 watts. Like we're nearly double the performance of those at 20 watts. And then same thing at 30 watts. We're almost doubling the performance at 30 watts, nearly double at 40 watts. And it just keeps going, right? All the way up across the board. As high as the CPU can go, we are more efficient. We are getting more performance at the same wattage than those CPUs. And that's where Intel really killed it this generation. You know, a lot of desktop users weren't super happy about that. They didn't really care about efficiency. They don't really care about their CPU running a little bit cooler. Laptop users, we love this. And I'm talking some MacBooks in here. MacBooks don't really require that much wattage. They usually top out around 50 to 60 watts. So of course we are going to surpass those, but at that 50 to 60 watt level, we're still getting beat by, you know, like the M4 Pro, M3 Max, and the M4 Max. Now, single core power scaling is the second most important because there's still a lot of single threaded programs and games out there. So you want to see this also run at a really low wattage really well, because this is especially going to affect like how much performance you get on battery. And yeah, the 275HX, it doesn't look too great at like 5 to 10 watts, but it starts pretty much keeping in line with the competition at around 15 to 25 watts. So could have been better, but still not a bad result for a Windows laptop. laptop, since this is where pretty much all of them are. When you look at a MacBook, you know, a MacBook at 5 watts is hitting what this does at like 30 watts, you know, hitting the full performance that these guys can even achieve. That's why you see MacBooks do so well on battery life and performance on battery. And then here's Cinebench R24 for those interested. All right, let's talk about this GPU, right? The RTX 5090, running at the full 175 watts allowed, and every version of the Omen Max 16 runs its GPU at the full wattage, which is 175 watts on the 5080, 140 watts on the 5070 Ti, and 115 watts on the 5070 and 5060. You're going to see it in the gaming benchmarks, but the full-powered 5090 appears to usually be around 15 to 20% more FPS than the RTX 4090 at its full wattage. So while I wouldn't consider that a really good 2-year jump in performance, it's something. You know, I think at release it looked a lot worse, especially when they were benchmarking like the Blade 16 as the first 5090 laptop, you know, and that one was only like 5 to 10% ahead. This one, at least, you know, it has the latest NVIDIA drivers, which actually let it run at its full wattage. You know, it paints a little bit better picture. Would I have loved to see even more? Absolutely. Maybe I was a little too hopeful, but I was really hoping for like a generational jump like we had from, you know, 3080 to 4080. That was huge, right? That was like 40% or something. But yeah, we're not so lucky this time. Regardless though, I mean, there are some other nice to have things here. Of course, 24 gigabytes of VRAM on the 5090, 16 gigabytes of VRAM on the 5080, and 12 gigabytes of VRAM on the 5070 Ti. Those are all good improvements over the previous generation. Oh, and please do not forget, if you get this laptop, go in the Omen Gaming Hub software on the performance mode, turn on smart performance gain, and raise those sliders all the way up. Otherwise, you are not getting the full GPU performance out of this laptop. And that is crazy that it's not enabled by default, but please, HP, fix that. And anyone who buys this laptop, change that immediately. Anyways, let's look at Time Spy scores here. So yeah, the Omen Max breaks 25K in Time Spy. Like, that's really cool to see. Like, that's about a 17% increase over a full powered 4090, but it's only about a 10% increase over a full powered 5080. And sure enough, it's kind of the same way in games too. It's about a 10 to 15% increase in FPS over the full powered 5080 laptops. So really, this GPU is for people that just want a lot of VRAM, or you just have the budget to spare, right? You just want that extra FPS. You don't really care how much it costs to get there. And you can see wattage matters a lot on this GPU. Look at that 130 watts on the 5090 in the G16. It gets a little over 20K. That puts us 25% ahead of that one on the same GPU, only running like 40 watts less. So yeah, the 5090 loves wattage and it's not very efficient. In balance mode, this laptop still absolutely kills it, over 19K graphics score. And then same thing in silent mode. We're hitting almost 19K graphics in silent mode, which is crazy, you guys. I know, yeah, the Blade 16 is actually a little bit ahead of this one, but in games they're like kind of back and forth in their silent modes, but the Blade 16 is like 10 times louder in its silent mode, so you can almost ignore that completely. That silent mode is almost like a turbo mode in other laptops, whereas the Omen Max 16, the silent mode can ramp up the fans a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty darn quiet. On batteries, where the Omen Max 16 really suffers, you're going to see that in gaming benchmarks as well. 3,000 points graphics score on battery. That is like terrible. That's like worse than some integrated graphics. That's because the 5090 just is not that efficient. And speaking of integrated graphics, you know, we're only a little bit behind just running it on battery here. Still pretty poor. At 2,000 graphics score, we're like still getting beat by laptops from like 3 or 4 years ago here. So not a great sight to see. Steel Nomad is like purely GPU performance. It really pushes the GPU to its full wattage and full potential. Although I don't really find it to be representative of gaming performance very well. Like, it makes the 5090 look really good here. We're approaching desktop 4080 levels of performance on this benchmark, but really in games, that's not always the case. And then here's balanced and silent mode and Steel Nomad for those interested. There you go. Now, if you're a creator, you're going to love this laptop, unless you're on battery. So here's why. I think this laptop can definitely work really well for creators, although that's not its main angle. It kind of just like happens to be good at being a decent creator laptop as well as being a gaming laptop. So let's start with Photoshop, right? So we're getting a Puja score of about a little over 8,000. That's still a good result. It's just nowhere near the new like G16 or even last year's G16, but it does get beat out by a lot of laptops here with, you know, lower power GPU options. And that's the same for balance mode and silent mode. Unfortunately, we are pretty much middle of the line or below the middle. And on battery, you know, you're pretty much out of luck. Couldn't even get the full benchmark to load in the silent mode on battery. But for video editors, Premiere Pro, however, is looking really good. Nearing the top of the charts, yeah, we're somehow getting beat by the Legion Pro 7i with a lower tier GPU, and we're not that much farther ahead than the G16 with a lot less wattage going to its 5090. So nearly leading the charts, but it's not as impressive when you start looking at some of these other laptops. However, in balanced and silent mode, where I feel like a lot of video editors will probably be, because you don't really want to hear super loud fans when you're editing video, that's where it really excels. You know, it's leading the charts here. But then again, on battery, like, just count this thing out. If you're going to be on battery editing video a lot, this is not the laptop for you. DaVinci Resolve, it's got a decent little lead over the G16 with the 130 watt 5090. So yeah, it's looking good here. And then again, in balanced mode and silent mode is where it just kills it, just like in games. But then again, on battery, we start to see that same pattern. I think it's just the HP thing, because like, look at the Omen 14. It's getting like the same score. You know, you're getting worse than like a 4060 laptop's worth of performance on battery. Not looking great. And then latency mon, this is the latency that you'll get when using the laptop for video and audio tasks. It's not super great here either. I mean, I've definitely seen worse, but I've also seen a lot better. But one area where it surprisingly did excel was music production. So I run an Ableton benchmark, and you can do this on your system too, by the way. It's super easy. If you want to compare, you just download the Ableton demo and run the included demo session. And then you just look at your CPU tab and see the percentage that it's running at. Lower percentage is better. Typically, we want to see it around 20% or so for this particular track, because that signifies a really high performing CPU from what I've found. And I think this actually takes the cake for the best performing laptop I've had in this benchmark. On both Ableton 11 and 12, I was hitting like 13 to 15%, which is stupid low. Like, that is crazy for, you know, these demo tracks, which have like a ton of tracks and effects and layers and stuff. So that is a great result for Ableton. I think music producers will really like this thing. All right, so let's take a look at the thermals on this thing and the wattage that it runs at. So typically when you're gaming, that is what's going to push your GPU and your CPU to the maximum that they can go. However, this highly depends on the game that you're playing, right? If you're playing Valorant or Counter-Strike 2, games like that are going to push the CPU a bit more, whereas games like Cyberpunk or Horizon Zero Dawn, Black Myth Wukong, you know, visually stunning single-player games, those usually push the GPU more. So I'm going to simulate that and give you a really realistic scenario of what you can expect here using the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. So first, we're going to run it to simulate a GPU-bound scenario, GPU-bound games. That's going to be the highest settings at 1600p, which you can copy this if you want to test this out on your own laptop. This is just the highest preset, DLSS off. And then when we want to test CPU bound, we're going to change it to 1080p at the lowest settings. That's going to make the GPU take a little bit of a backseat, and then it's going to push the CPU a lot harder. So let's have a look. All right, so you can see that manual / unleashed mode. One thing I find kind of funny is it actually runs the CPU about the same and sometimes a little bit less of wattage than the stock performance / turbo mode. I'm going to call it turbo mode, but they call it performance. You know, we're hitting near 175 watts, kind of hovering around 170, 71 on the GPU in both manual, unleashed, and turbo mode. And then it's anywhere from like 50 to 70 watts on the stock turbo mode, and it's anywhere from like 50 to 65-ish watts on the unleashed mode. So I don't know, I find that kind of strange, especially since the fans are running louder in unleashed mode. You would think that there'd be a little bit more power there, but yeah, I mean, temps are looking fine. I mean, the GPU is running pretty ice cold at like 70 degrees here, and the CPU isn't too bad either. I mean, it's in like the 90s or upper 80s most of the time, but it definitely can get warmer than that. Balanced and silent mode are looking really good though. This is with me removing the 60 FPS limit on the silent mode, so you can see it's running almost the same as balanced mode, 95 watts on the GPU. Balanced mode is hitting 105 watts, so it's getting about 10 more watts, and both are in the 60s on the GPU, which is ice cold for a laptop, and then about 70s on the CPU, running at a pretty low but feasible 25 watts up to like 35 watts. If the silent mode is running stock with the 60 FPS cap on it, the GPU is only running at like 45 to 50 watts, and it's even colder at 55 degrees. Same with the CPUs at 65 degrees on this now. So if you're cool with the 60 FPS limit, I mean, that is ice cold temps for a gaming laptop. Now, when you're CPU bound, it's kind of strange. I mean, we're hitting, again, about 5-ish to 10 more watts on turbo mode than unleashed mode. And even though we're CPU bound, it's getting a little bit more GPU wattage on turbo mode still compared to unleashed mode, with with pretty similar temps yet again, you know, mid 80s on the CPU and an ice cold mid 60s on the GPU. But again, we're CPU bound. You can see the GPU is running as low as like 70 to 90 watts, as high as like 125. So it's really taking a back seat here. Balance and silent mode, their GPUs are running around like 50 to 65 watts or so. Ice cold again at low 60s. And then their CPUs are running actually up to about 70 watts in balance mode before it kind of goes down to about 45 or so. And then about 30 to 35 watts in silent mode, with temps in balance mode being as high as like 85 degrees and as low as like mid 70s. And then silent mode's about low 70s to high 60s. So overall, these are not bad temperatures at all. I was really surprised after seeing some of the early reviews saying that the temps get really high on this thing. And I have noticed that in some games where the GPU is hitting like its full 175 watts and then also the CPU is hitting like over 60 watts, you know, 70 to 80, that's when it starts to get pretty toasty. That's when you start to see those temps of like 95 to 100, even 105. But we've seen Intel engineers talk about this. They're super confident that these chips are very capable of running, you know, at 105, 110 degrees pretty much indefinitely. Like if the chip is rated for it, like I'm cool with that. We've seen temps like this even in like MacBooks and things of years past with Intel. So it's like, to me, it's not a huge deal, but to some people it might be. And of course, there's ways to mitigate that, which I'll show you here in a second on my recommended settings. Now, the Omen Max 16 is of course using their new liquid metal compound, which is supposed to be like a liquid metal pad similar to PTM, but with some of the benefits of liquid metal. However, my friend Braxton has discovered that just regular liquid metal actually runs cooler on this laptop than this compound, which he's made a video for about here. Highly recommend checking that out. So while I do applaud that, you know, companies are trying to find solutions for how much variation there can be in factory liquid metal application, I don't think this is like the perfect solution yet. Temps are definitely a little bit lower once you have a good liquid metal job, preferably done by hand. The Omen Max 16 also has kind of a cool feature where the fans can run backwards to sort of help get rid of the dust buildup. And I think this is a cool feature. You know, I'm not sure how good it actually works because I haven't had the laptop long enough, obviously, for dust to build up in there. But that being said, I'm always in favor of features that sort of help, you know, offset a bit of the user error, right? Like we see a lot of posts where people are like, my CPU temps are through the roof, and they just had dusty fans. So it's good to see like there's something at least being done a little bit by a company. So hopefully this sort of mitigates that dust buildup issue a bit. Even if it's not perfect, I think a little bit is better than nothing. And I'm happy to just see some innovation there because that's kind of just a cool feature. All right, so if you get this laptop, here's what I recommend running it at. Now, right off the bat, if you're someone who doesn't really care about fan noise that much, just run it in its stock performance mode. You know, with the fans on auto for like 52-ish decibels or max out for like, you know, really loud 56 decibels. With one major caveat though, and that is the power settings. For the love of God, make sure that smart performance gain is turned on with the sliders all the way up, or else you are not getting the full wattage that this laptop can provide. So yeah, with that being said, here we are in Cyberpunk 2077, pretty much maxed out on graphics, the ray tracing ultra settings, no frame generation, hitting like 105 FPS or so. GPU is close to 175 watts, CPU is hitting just about 70 watts, and yeah, those temps are high, right? It's hitting near the thermal limit of the CPU. So personally, that does not bother me. I know that Intel engineers have designed this thing to hit, you know, up to 105 or 110C, I think is the actual max of the CPU, and it can theoretically run that way for years. But if those temps bother you, all you got to do is go over to Unleashed mode. You're going to set your PL1 to about 40 to 50 watts. That's your sustained CPU power limit. And then you're going to set your PL2 to 60 watts, which is your boosting power limit on the CPU. This is what it can hold for about 2 or 3 minutes. And then of course, make sure the smart performance gain is on and that wattage is all the way up. Hit apply. And I have the fans on auto here, but you can lower or raise these to taste. I found if you want it to be like the stock turbo mode, stock performance mode, you can run it on manual, put it around the middle of the slider. And there you have it. The CPU is hitting, you know, 60 watts. It is currently boosting. You know, it's still toasty around 95 degrees, but it's not hitting that over 100 that it was before. And FPS is about the same as it was before. Now we can lower this even more by lowering that boost power limit even more, say, you know, 50 watts. So let's try that out and check it out. It boosted to 50 watts and slowly started going down to 45, 40 watts. Now we are under 90 degrees on that CPU. We're looking pretty good. Same with the GPU, sitting nice and cool around 76. while our FPS remains basically unchanged. Now, me personally, I don't like a super loud laptop, and I thought this was kind of funny. You can actually turn unleashed mode into a extremely powerful, like silent/balanced mode. Just put the fans on manual, put that slider pretty much all the way down. You can maybe raise it just a hair if you want, and then change the CPU sliders on PL1 and PL2 to like 35 to 40 watts. And we're going to turn that GPU wattage down a little bit too using the smart performance gain. Although I found when I put it down a little bit, it was still running like near the full wattage of the GPU. So I actually had to go back and just turn that off for it to actually recognize that I was trying to give it less wattage. But even before I did that, I was running, look at this, almost 170 watts on the GPU. Yeah, I was getting, 81 degrees, but that's really not bad. And the CPU was hitting like 90 degrees. And keep in mind, this where the fans are right now is like 41, 42 decibels. And then after turning smart performance gain off, we're getting, 145 to 150 watts on the GPU. Now it's running around 80 degrees or less. And then the CPU is at 90 degrees or less. Our FPS went down maybe like 5 FPS or so. And we're getting like half the fan noise. Like 41, 42 decibels is very quiet for a gaming laptop, like super quiet. So this is how I would probably use the laptop majority of the time. Or maybe just give it a little more fans on that manual fan slider if I'm really trying to get a little bit more wattage out of it. I even tried 35 watts, which is the lowest you can get on the CPU slider. And yeah, we lost maybe 10 FPS, but still over 90 FPS on the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. CPU temps are in the mid to high 80s. The fans are super low. GPU is still staying under 80 degrees. Like, this is crazy. So if anyone says the Omen Max 16 has bad temps, show them this. You can easily manage it. Okay, so gaming benchmarks on the Omen Max 16. Bit of a spoiler alert here, but this thing is a beast in games, okay? It's going to give you basically top tier performance out of like an RTX 5090 laptop. I think the only things that are going to surpass this are ones that can push their CPU a little bit further. Things that are like even bulkier than this guy, like, the Alienware Area 51 or laptops like that, basically, that are even heavier, have a higher combined wattage output. Those may surpass this in games, but in most games at QHD, you are fairly GPU bound anyways. And with the Intel 275HX being a lot more efficient than some of their Intel CPUs of the past, it actually levels the playing field quite a bit no matter which laptop you're getting, as long as you're not like throttling like crazy. So, and then just to give you a heads up on like what to expect if you get the 5080 model, you're going to want to look at the Legion Pro 7i in my benchmarks. That one's basically going to be in line with the Omen Max 5080. And for the 5070 Ti, it's about 15 to 20% worse than the 5080, maybe a little more depending on the game. 5070 is about 15 to 20% or so worse than the 5070 Ti. And then the 5060 is about 10% or so worse than the 5070. So just to give you like a rough idea, I'm still reviewing more laptops, so be sure to subscribe so you can check that out. And yes, I know I have some 5070 Ti laptops already in my benchmarks, but just keep in mind that those are not running at the full 140 watts that GPU offers. So, it's going to be a bit ahead of those if you get like the 5070 Ti config. So anyways, starting with Apex Legends here, Omen Max, by no surprise, is leading the pack. This game does have some GPU reliance, but CPU matters a lot in this game. That's why you see the Legion Pro 7i pretty much neck and neck here until we get to balance mode where the HP Omen is just killing it. Like, you're going to see it as a pattern here. The balance mode on this guy is insane. Black Myth Wukong, we're leading by a pretty fair margin, 89 FPS. The next closest thing is the full powered 5080 at 78 FPS. And then I'd say like a full powered 5070 Ti is probably going to be around that 60 FPS mark. In Black Ops 6, again, we're leading the pack here by a good little margin, 131 FPS. And even in balance mode, we don't lose that much performance, but we do lose a lot of fan noise, and we're running at 104 FPS still. So really good result there. Cyberpunk, I like to run a lot of different presets on this one because it has a lot of variety and it shows you how a GPU is performing, especially in combination with the CPU and DLSS and frame gen and all that stuff. So starting with the RT Ultra preset, which is ray tracing on, DLSS Auto, which is set to balanced by default. And I'm not using the new Transformers preset. I'm using the traditional CNN preset, which is what I have the most data for. But yeah, you can see again, the Omen Max 16 way ahead of everyone else, 96 FPS. This one really makes these other like lower wattage 5090 laptops look really bad here. Like the Blade 16 at 160 watts, even though that one really runs at like 130 to 140 watts. That thing gets 77 FPS. The 130 watt 5090 and the G16 gets 74. We are like a whole generation ahead of those guys in this game. Like, this is one of the more drastic increases, but that's about a 30% increase. That's huge, which goes to show the this GPU is not the most efficient, but hey, if you like performance, that's a great number to see. Balance mode, 75 FPS, you know, kind of lowers the playing field a little bit on balance mode on this game. And then silent mode, this is what I was talking about. If you remove that 60 FPS cap in silent mode, you pretty much get the same performance as balance mode, and we're beating out everybody there. Now, the ultra preset is more reliant on just raw GPU power, and I thought this was funny, like 133 FPS. Again, that's almost 30% more FPS than the lower wattage 5090s. That's crazy. And then in balanced and silent mode, still really good. 160 FPS in balance mode, 64 FPS in silent mode. Did lose a little bit more in silent mode on this one, but 64 FPS is still great. Now, ray tracing overdrive, this is like the max preset of the game, right? This is like the highest path tracing, you know, all the extra goodies. And we're hitting over 118 FPS. Now, by default, this does have 2x frame gen, but still, like, look at it in comparison to like a 4070 laptop, right? The 4070 Legion 7i down here, you know, was getting 34 FPS in this benchmark. We're getting 118. That's like going from like a Game Boy Advance to like a PS5. And then 4K is another one where we're like doubling that of like 4070 laptops. The ultra preset here, we're getting 66 FPS. This is very GPU reliant at 4K. So you can see it's like a nice stairway down depending on which GPU you have and the wattage it's running at. And don't get scared, but I do want to talk about multi-frame gen just a little bit, because in games like Cyberpunk, it actually works surprisingly well, like way better than I thought it would, to the point where I don't think I could go back to not using frame gen in this game. And that's coming from someone who hated the idea of another gimmick from NVIDIA, but let me explain this graph real quick. So this has multi-frame gen up to 4x. You can see we're getting 211 FPS on the max ray tracing overdrive preset with 4x frame gen on the Omen Max. And that's just to like show you the possibilities. I'd probably run it at 3x frame gen really here. I know NVIDIA would love this graph because of how much of a difference it looks, you know, going from like 34 FPS on a 4070 laptop to like 211, you know, whatever. It's a gimmick, but it's a pretty good one. So take that how you will. Forza Horizon 5, again, the 5090 just leads by a lot more than I thought it would. 174 FPS. That's about a 27% increase from the full powered 4090 from last gen. Although I think that CPU is helping a good bit here in this game as well. In balance mode, we're getting 138 FPS, and then silent mode, this is another one where it just pretty much stays the same, 135 FPS. Just insane numbers, leaving everybody so far behind, it's not even funny. This is another one I run in 4K. Again, you can see sort of just that nice step down depending on the GPU and the wattage it's running at. 119 FPS versus, you know, what we were getting 103 FPS on a full powered 4090 from last gen. So about a 15% increase there. I'll put a text box here if I run Helldivers 2 again and it stays the same. But yeah, this game likes a lot of CPU power, and the Legion Pro 7i has a ton that it can offer. You know, I think it was pulling like 250, 260 combined watts in this game, which is why I think it pulls ahead so much. But then again, the Omen Max 16 should be further ahead of the G16 than it is here. So not too sure what was going on there. In balance mode on Helldivers though, again, 133 FPS, leading the pack. Horizon Zero Dawn, 181 FPS, about a 14% bump over a full powered 4090 from last gen, and a pretty significant like 50% jump in performance over like a 5070 Ti laptop. So NVIDIA did it once again, making a huge performance disparity between each level of GPU. So thanks a lot, NVIDIA, making us have to spend, you know, thousands of dollars. Anyways, balance mode, 145 FPS, silent mode, still 145 FPS. Amazing. In 4K, did really good too, 107 FPS, leading the pack once again. It's like the same story over and over, right? 1080p, leading the pack and looking good. Shadow of the Tomb Raider has a good bit of mixture of GPU and CPU bound. That's why you see the Legion Pro 7i coming really close, because it actually has a higher combined wattage output, but that 5090 still helps it hit over 200 FPS in this benchmark. So yeah, I mean, it's a decent little jump over 4090 laptops. Nothing crazy in this one, but then again, you get to balance mode and silent mode, and it's kind of crazy now. You know, we're way ahead, especially in silent mode. Although, yes, of course, that silent mode can get a little louder than some others. And then in 4K, we're about 19% ahead of a full powered 4090 laptop. So that seems to be like the pattern here, that it's usually about 15 to 20% ahead of a full powered 4090. 1080p relies a lot more on the CPU, and this is one where some other laptops start pulling ahead here. To be honest, it probably should have scored a little higher than that. I'm not really sure what happened. This is one where I run it on battery too, and that's where the Omen really fails. 38 FPS, we're like near the bottom of the chart now. Same with USB-C power delivery. This is not a great laptop for that. We are at the bottom of the chart, 32 FPS. Same thing with integrated graphics. You know, make sure you're not on iGPU mode for gaming, because that's really bad. 21 FPS here. All right, so in conclusion, right, here's the pros and cons. This is an extremely powerful laptop. It actually is one of the few that feels like a decent upgrade over 4080 and 4090 laptops, if you're getting the 5080, 5090 models. It has well-tuned fans with a good amount of customization on top of that. It's very sleek with a mostly metal build. You have a beautiful OLED display. The software is not bad, and it even has really advanced CPU tuning built right in. So yeah, just stellar performance, sleek and premium, and for the price, it cannot be beat. Like, this is the best performance per dollar laptop that you're likely to find in the US with nearly weekly discounts. Plus, the HP website is very customizable with what you can order as far as CPU and GPU options. Now for the cons. Just like the Legion Pro 7i and Alienware and a lot of these other thicker laptops, it's thick and it's heavy. It has a massive 380 watt charger on the 5080 and 5090 models, and it can get pretty loud in turbo mode, especially if you're in manual mode and you're turning those fans up or maxing them out. Silent mode triggers like a 60 FPS cap, but it doesn't need that, and you can disable it, thankfully. The plastic trackpad, average speakers. If you want to go into eco mode for battery life where the GPU is disabled, it requires a restart. You also get no USB-C port with a DGPU connection. You get poor performance on battery, and then the battery life overall isn't the greatest, depending on which CPU that you choose, because like the AMD models should actually have great battery life here. And then lastly, these are just sort of nitpicks, not huge cons here, but there's no factory color profile installed, at least not that I could find. The heat pipe blocking the stock SSD, kind of weird, and then the lack of GPU tuning in the software. Like, a lot of other laptops at this caliber allow you to tune the wattage of the GPU, not just overclocking, but this one only has overclocking. But yeah, I mean, this guy performs incredibly well. Like, it leaves behind a lot of other gaming laptops, leaving them in the dust, honestly. In most games, it's giving us about a 14% boost to FPS over like the RTX 5080, like in the Legion Pro 7i here, which of course is just, a GPU difference. But even at the same GPU level, if you're looking at it in comparison to a lower wattage, more portable laptop like the Zephyrus G16, you're looking at a 20 to 25% increase in FPS over, these thinner laptops like the G16 and the Blade 16. At least at the 5080 and 5090 level, which, I mean, that's a fairly large gap. And, that really comes at the major sacrifice, again, of it being thick and heavy. Like, those laptops are the kings of portability this year, the G16 and Blade 16. While the Omen, it's great, you can still carry it around, but it's meant to be, at a desk plugged in. But the balance mode and silent mode fans are insane. Like, you get such good performance for very little fan noise in those power profiles. So if you're trying to play, at good performance levels around friends or family, this is a great laptop for that. But keep in mind though, if you do choose a lower GPU option, something lower than the 5080, then the performance difference between this and like a G16 isn't going to be as much, because those GPUs only go up to 140 watts on the 5070 Ti and only up to 115 watts on the 5070 and 5060. So, this guy, just like the Legion Pro 7i here, are actually a little bit overkill for those lower to mid GPU options. It doesn't make them a bad choice. It's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, the weight and the poor performance on battery for me are the two biggest things that would hold it back from, me personally choosing this laptop. But I mean, those might not even be a factor for yourself. And if it isn't, then this is seriously an impressive piece of machinery from HP. And to me, it might even be my pick for like best performance king of the year. It's got just enough premium features. It's got a sleek build, good fan tuning. And most of all, I just cannot praise the price enough. Like, the HP website is throwing out discount codes like Halloween candy. All right. And every week is Halloween. That's how good the sales are on this. I'm seeing people get the 5070 Ti model for about $1,200, which is just unheard of. I'm seeing people get the 5080 for like $1,800 or less. And even the 5090 model has been going for like a little over $2,000. Like, these are crazy low prices in a market that is dominated by laptops that are going for almost double or over double these amounts. Like, for example, if you scored that 5070 Ti deal where this is coming out to like $1,250 or something like that, you could literally buy two of these for the price of one Zephyrus G16 at its full price. So I'm just saying, like, this may not be the best fit for you or someone like me, as far as like portability and premium features, things like that. But, and I totally get that. But at the same time, you cannot beat that performance per dollar. You got to respect it. And I want to see more of this from other brands like Asus, Lenovo. We need more of this. I hope others hop on this trend like HP because they are killing the competition right now in the price department. Like, it's making everyone else look bad at this point. And I love to see that. Like, I love competition. I love when someone comes in and disrupts things. So if you love what you see enough to maybe buy one of these guys, I would appreciate it if you use the links in my description, which helps support the channel. And of course, hit that like and subscribe button while you're at it. But anyways, that's all I got. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.